I'm a freelance writer working on creative arts projects, and I'm also a researcher, and I'm really interested in people's history and also histories of migration. So I'm working on a PhD looking at how you research, record and also communicate refugee lives in Scotland. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this conference today. Growing up Maclean, as folk have mentioned, particularly the songs about them were really woven into my life. We had the poster from a concert in 1973 up in my living room. It was quite similar to that one. And I remember, like, as a child reading it and really being struck by this sentence, or the idea of somebody forging the Scottish link in the golden chain of world socialism. And I still like to think about that on a much less dramatic scale, but just about how our actions and passions don't exist in isolation, but connect us to the work and the struggles of people across the world. And I think like each step forward that we take is a link in that chain. And so with that in mind, my talk today is going to have the structure of a walk, taking quite literally this title in the footsteps of John Maclean. And I thought, like, maybe at this point in the day you would want to get up and stretch your legs and take a wee walk, but unfortunately it's going to be an imaginary walk. But that does have the massive advantage of allowing us to disregard the Glasgow weather. So I'm really interested in walking as a research method and as a way of thinking and as a way of communicating histories. And I'm going to borrow a really beautiful phrase from one of my colleagues at Glasgow Uni, Ben White, who says history looks different from the streets than it does from the library, which I think is very true. And I think that Maclean's a great figure to think about walking with. Many of you will have heard that he would walk twice daily from his house in Pollokshields to teacher training college and later to lectures in the city's West End. And the artist Kira Maclean, whose beautiful stained glass window of John Maclean is going to open in Pollokshields Library on the 30th of November, she said on her Instagram recently that she chose to depict Maclean in his hat and his coat to represent his role in the creation of a, quote, a political street culture of meetings, protest and discussion. He was a tramper through and through and would often hike the length and breadth of Glasgow many times in a day. And I think when you look at his life, you can see that it's filled with many different kinds of walking. Marching, rallying, tramping to give speeches at factory gates and city squares. And you have to assume that while some of that was just pragmatic, how you got around, he must also, I think, have genuinely enjoyed moving around the city under his own steam, observing what people were doing, what's going on, probably fitting together his thoughts and his writing as he moved around, going from place to place. So I'm sure I'm probably going to touch on things that other people have mentioned, but I hope that having this street level approach it will maybe allow us to look at Maclean and some of his legacies from a different perspective. So, so part of the reason that I'm here today, because I'm not a Maclean scholar like a lot of other people, it's down to my work in documenting and celebrating radical history of Glasgow through walking tours. So starting from May Day last year, which is a very auspicious date to start something like this, I've been working with Henry Bell, who we all know and love, and David Lees, who is a banner maker, hard worker, general schemer over at Galgale in Govan, on radical Glasgow tours. So we set up the group because we were really interested in the city's radical histories and how very little trace so many of these histories there are in the built environment. So the statues and the street names commemorate slave traders, merchants, royals who presided over the bloodthirsty British Empire. But how are our histories remembered? Through the work of people and organisations like the Scottish Labour History Society, but also through the songs and the poems and the oral traditions, the family legends, the old pamphlets and the wee badges, and you know, the grandfather who saw the red flag raised in George Square, or the faded placards that you couldn't part with. Like, we still got the placard from when Mandela came to Glasgow in the cupboard because they just can't get rid of it, you know. And you know, the forgotten songbooks from the back room of a trade union office. And I also think it's important to mention the more ephemeral histories, like those people who never got to write an autobiography, the actions that never appeared in forwards, or the people for whom documenting their lives and activism was unwise or unsafe. And I think these people in histories bear remembering and celebrating just as the likes of Maclean do, and we found walks to be a really good way of doing that. So back in April, Henry and I did a Maclean tour around these various stomping grounds in the south side, the sites where he lived, worked, fought and died. And his first job at St Bride's School in Govan Hill, which is the building you can see in this picture, he made an enemy of the head teacher, forming the Scottish Association of Socialist Teachers, and he campaigned against homework and corporal punishment. Outside Langside Halls, Maclean spoke out against World War I, describing the war as this murder business, and earned himself a trip to Queen's Park Police Station when some soldiers in the crowd took offence to this. And as you can see in this slide, the unsuspecting residents hearing about Maclean's funeral march before the tour made its way to end outside the Sir John Maxwell School building, beside the library in Pollockshaw's, where Maclean held adult education classes in 1907. And I've been told that a public petition for a night class in Capital by Karl Marx meant that these were likely the first state-funded classes in Marxism anywhere in the world. And that school, since we did that, that school is now gone. It was in terrible condition, deteriorating. It's now just an empty gap site. But anyway, so we've done that tour already. I'm not going to repeat that tour. So today's tour is going to walk us through some key sites in the city centre that I think can tell us something about Maclean and his work, and how that fitted into this vibrant ecosystem of radical working class formal and informal education in Glasgow that was going on around about that time. And I'll also mention some ways people have been continuing these traditions in the intervening years, and think about what it means to walk in somebody else's footsteps. So in theory, this is a real tour that you can do another time if you want. And as you walk in your imagination today, or if you happen to be really keen and do it another time, please can you picture John Maclean walking alongside you in the street? He would have walked all of these streets many, many times. And just to kind of give you an image, this is how Harry McShane described him. He said he had no show or anything of that description. And when he was speaking, he had very few gestures, unlike myself, I'm a big gesticulator. His head was inclined a little to the one side, and when he was walking through the street, he was like that. And he gave you the impression of a man deep in thought, thinking about things. That's the impression you always got. So one of the advantages I find of historical tours is that there's no need for the building that you're talking about to actually be there. In a city like Glasgow, sometimes the buildings that we're looking at today are maybe the third or fourth construction that stood on that site in the past 100 years. So with that in mind, our first imaginary stop is quite close to where we are today at 86 Bath Street. And this is behind the back of the old BHS building. Now it's quite an ugly, I think, quite an ugly 90s kind of fake sandstone building. But this used to be the Scottish Business Training College building, and it was one of the many locations where Maclean and his colleagues gave lectures to the students of the Scottish Labour History College. The Scottish Labour College. So the Labour College, the idea was that this was to be funded by a 1p a week contribution from all workers' wages from factories, mines and shipyards. And the money raised was to allow workplaces to send the students to 3-month intensive courses in subjects like Marxism, mathematics and public speaking. And the idea was they would then return to the workplace and cascade the learning to back to others. There was a really good recent article about this in the Scottish Left Review by Malcolm Petrie, and he said that at the height of the college in 1925 it had 6,000 students across nearly 250 courses. Sadly, it was relatively short-lived as a radical educational force, with the courses on Marxist economics replaced by the close of the interwar period by a curriculum that, quote, complemented the education offered by the state by providing practical campaigning and administrative skills for Labour Party activists. So incidentally, when I was reading about 86 Bath Street, I worked out that the Scottish Labour College and the famous West of Scotland College of Domestic Science, which is better known as the Glasgow Doe School, they both operated out of this same building at the same time. And we have to imagine there was a wee bit of cross-pollination here, the students getting into each other's classes. Probably, to be honest, I think the intricacies of Marxism and political science would have come as a blessed relief after the challenges of domestic science and household management. So here you can see some the cover of Maclean's notes from the Scottish Labour College. You can see this wasn't at the Bath Street building because it was dispersed around various locations in Glasgow. So this was in the West End behind Great Western Road, which you can now jump to on our imaginary tour. And there was more cross-pollination going on here too. This building at 13 Burnbank Gardens is also no longer there. But in 1916, when Maclean was given this lecture here, it housed the College Division Liberal Association. And it seems likely that the college would have continued to use it when it passed into the hands of Guy Aldred and Jenny Patrick and became renamed as Bakunin House. And Aldred's 1923 pamphlet, Socialism in Parliament, you can see that they're trying to drum up business, like hall hire for the building, because there's a text at the end saying they'll rent out the hall for committee meetings and lectures and things like that. So although the Scottish Labour College, it didn't last beyond the 1920s, maybe in the way that Maclean had envisaged it, radical adult education in Scotland did continue in different forms throughout the 20th century and on into the present day. Thinking here about the work of the Workers' Educational Association, ongoing trade union learning programmes, and the impact of the ideas of Paulo Freire in Scotland, most famously and probably long-lastingly with the Adult Learning Project through in Edinburgh. And I think that although the methods were quite different to the lectures that we experienced with Tam's speech, maybe a flavour of what it would have been like to be in the audience of Maclean's lectures, I feel like there is a shared affinity in the ultimate goal, which is the liberation of the oppressed by the oppressed themselves through education. And there's likewise been a really rich tradition of radical education for and by children and young people, which brings me on to the second stop, maybe the third stop, the next stop in the tour. So this is going to be in George Square, which is a site, as you all know, which is really rich in the histories of protest and dissent in Glasgow. And I think George Square would be pretty recognisable to the imaginary spirit of John Maclean that's coming with us on the tour. The statues of the various slave traders and colonial criminals regrettably remain unchanged, as do many of the grand buildings. There's far fewer train stations in the city than there was in Maclean's time, because the city at the turn of the 20th century was such a hub of industry that it needed 6 train stations to keep up with the production and transportation of goods and materials. So 4 of these have since gone, but Queen Street's still there, albeit with the new kind of space age golden frontage. So if you picture the scene, so this is 100 years ago, and there's a gang of children, young people and adults in high spirits, and they're heading to the station. They're going for a walk too, but they're going out of the industrial grime of the city for a day in the hills. And this is one of the city's socialist Sunday schools on an outing. Glasgow was an epicentre of the socialist Sunday school movement, with different schools in places like Springburn, Castlemilk and Govan. And the schools grew out of the labour movement and drew on the structure, but not so much the content, of the church Sunday schools for young people. Children could be christened into the Sunday schools and given naming certificates, and they sang socialist hymns and recited the 10 socialist precepts or commandments, which you can see up here. My favourite is number 4, honour good men, be courteous to all men, bow down to none. I think that's a great one. And also the young people were taught how to chair meetings, how to take the minutes, and to prepare them for a future in trade unions and activism and organising, and they invited different activists and speakers to come and visit the schools and speak to the young people. And they also hosted parties and took folk out of the city. And some notable alumni of the social Sunday schools, one was Jenny Lee, who was an early female MP. She was elected in 1929 to represent North Lanarkshire for the ILP. She was the youngest woman in the House of Commons, and at 24 she was an MP before she was able to vote for herself, because at that stage you had to be 30 to vote if you were a woman. She went on to marry Nye Bevan, the founder of the NHS, and to herself she founded the Open University, which she described as a great independent university which does not insult any man or woman, whatever their background, by offering them the second best. Nothing but the best is good enough. So in Maclean's time, the socialist Sunday schools were a part, as I said, of this ecosystem of radical education in Glasgow, alongside the formal adult education classes, powerful street orators, and the incredibly vibrant print cultures of the city. which churned out hundreds of thousands of books, pamphlets and leaflets. Guy Aldred and his pals from Maclean House, which I mentioned earlier, were some of these printers, and they operated out of Strickland Press on George Street for over 20 years. So I think socialist education aimed at children and young people, like the socialist Sunday schools and the more militant proletarian schools, which were run by Maclean's comrade Tom Anderson, these were not to everybody's taste, of course. So the proletarian schools were unsurprisingly described in the Catholic Telegraph as intending to indoctrinate the minds of young children with the most loathsome, revolutionary and blasphemous teachings that could be conceived. While even the far tamer socialist Sunday schools were considered, quote, undesirable from every point of view. So I found those quotes by looking up a newspaper archive, but I was told much the same by one of the people that came on one of the Radical Glasgow tours that we did recently, and he told me that his grandmother had been at school in the 1930s, and she'd really struggled with school, just found it really, really difficult. And the family had sent her along to the local, the Gorbals Socialist Sunday School, and she'd flourished there, and she was doing really, really well. But then the local priest got wind of this, and he visited the family, and he said, you need to take the daughter out of the Socialist Sunday School, or you will all go to hell. So there we go. So in the intervening years, we've seen the development of radical youth work in Scotland alongside long-standing youth wings of parties like the YCL. And I think the fortunes of these movements, like the socialist schools, have ebbed and flowed over the years, but I think there's always been an appetite among young people for radical ideas. And so it's been with the idea of a socialist Sunday school in Glasgow. They ran up till the 1980s, but then they fell out of fashion a bit. But it's recently been revived for the 21st century under the name of Red Sunday School. And I'm really pleased to be a part of organising this new school, which continues on this rich tradition of radical education for Glasgow young people. And when we were setting this up, we really wanted to reconnect with the history of the socialist school movement in a meaningful way, while also rising to some of the challenges around education today. The working class is multiracial, and we wanted to bring that to the fore through exploring local histories and the power of diversity in the South Side and developing anti-racist solidarities. And we're trying to show the kids that the histories that we're talking about today are their histories. And we're wanting to do with Red Sunday School what Sylvia Pankhurst described Maclean as doing in his obituary, in which she wrote, "He caused young men and women to think and read for themselves." So just a quick plug here, if you know any young people who might like to join us, we're in Kinnan Park on the last Sunday of the month. So we're there next Sunday from 11:30 to 1. This month it's a Palestine Solidarity session with drop-in activities and a community meal. So very welcome. So that's the promotion finished with, so back to the tour. So this is the final stop, right? And it's related to one of those ghostly train stations that I mentioned before, which is Buchanan Street Station. And many of you will know the Matt McGinn song, The Ballad of John Maclean, in which a speaker says, "I'm headed for the station that's in Buchanan Street. I'll join 200,000 that's there to meet the train that's bringing home to Glasgow our own dear John Maclean." And there he is in the photo getting out of jail. And I chose this stop because there's a great eyewitness account of his arrival in the city by Dora Montefiore, who was on the executive of the British Socialist Party. And it made me think of other ways of walking in the city. I've mentioned Maclean walking around probably on his own deep in thought, but this made me think about walking shoulder to shoulder with other people in conversation. You mentioned Kenmure Street, the power of the crowd and the big group of people in the street. So this is how Montefiore describes this procession. She says, "The next day, Tuesday 3rd of December, a huge demonstration was arranged to meet John Maclean at Buchanan Street Station on the occasion of his return from prison. The crowd, which had completely blocked the traffic, drew the carriage through the main streets of Glasgow, while Maclean stood on the seat waving a huge red banner." I really liked Montefiore's description of the shouts of the crowd in Jamaica Street being, quote, "of a volume of sound that the capitalists of Clydeside will often remember in the near future when they are troubled with bad dreams." What a great quote. And I think like some of the best known and best loved songs about Maclean, like the Matt McGinn one I just quoted, or Hamish Henderson's John Maclean March, it shows Maclean from the perspective of of the listener in the street, the working man, because they are, it is men that these songs are addressing themselves to. But the descriptions of Maclean's reception in Buchanan Street, it reminds us of the impact that mass gatherings can have on the city, grinding the traffic to a halt and forcing, quote, the trams to take to their homes the daily loads of shoppers to travel till the river was crossed at the rate of John Maclean's triumphal red flag procession. So this is another kind of walk-in, the crowds filling the streets, the voices like those in the songs explaining to the new arrivals what's going on, who is this, what's happening here. So I feel really fortunate to be just one among many people that are really interested in walk-in and radical histories and radical education and the connections between these things. I think lots of people have seen the potential of the walk-in tour or the derive that situationists were into, or the guideless walk and talk with a group. The City Strolls website, which I'm sure a lot of folk will know, that's got a decade of walking and thinking about and recording Glasgow histories recorded on there. And there's many guides that walk around the city streets, leading people through the past lives of the city. I was recently shown around the People's Palace by Nelson Cummins from Glasgow Museums, and that was a tour which explored the way the People's Palace and Glasgow Green have been impacted by Glasgow's links to slavery and empire. And I also wanted to mention the Glasgow Women's Library's Women's History Walks, which have long uncovered histories that should be better known. So it's a real pleasure to feel yourself part of that, I keep saying ecosystem, but I do feel like it's like that, to be part of that. This ecosystem of radical walkers, past and present, and forging wee links in the golden chain of socialism with each step, I hope. So what I'm going to do is, I thought I'd take those out. I'm going to put the references up in a nicer form than that on our Radical Glasgow Tours website, where you can get access to them all the sources that I used for today if you want to know more. And there's also, each of our other walks have got a list of resources, and so it's sort of a space to collect up information on different radical histories and figures in Glasgow. And we're going to have a new programme. We've stopped for the winter because of the weather, but in the springtime we'll have a new public programme of tours, and we've got a mailing list if you want to hear about those. But we are always open for commissions. We've worked with a few trade unions to offer tours to their staff, or if any of you are fabulously wealthy, you can commission us to do a tour which will help us run the public tours at very low cost. So I feel like that was talking quite fast there. But so we would now have a space for questions, right? But instead of listening to me mainly respond to questions for another 15 minutes, I thought, in the spirit of Maclean's commitment to radical education and his belief in the value of knowledge as a driver of revolutionary change, I'd like to invite you, instead of asking me questions, how about you turn to somebody sitting beside them and have a conversation with them. Hopefully you'll have plenty to talk about from the day already, but if you need a wee prompt, here's a couple of things you could, oh no, I had the last slide was the questions. You're joking, you need to think of your own questions. I was going to suggest, if you didn't have any questions, you could ask, what new knowledge will you take away from today, or also think, whose footsteps are you following in? So if you're up for that, have a wee chat with the folk around you. All right.